what the next two scenes are, they're somewhat different because it feels that the writers were trying to solve a different problem. They both happen on Dragonstone, and a lot of season 7 is Jon and Dany trying to make each other submit to their will. Jon needs Dany to bring her dragons up north to fight the Night King, and she needs him to
kneel.
Yeah, to give up being king in the north.
That's all she wants.
Yeah.
And then for all Dany's talk about breaking the wheel, all Dany wants is people to kneel, take the knee.
But we're not actually going to talk about any of the scenes between her and Jon because those kind of play out almost as you expect, given their pre-established character loops. The two scenes that feel like they're there to push these characters in one direction or another. I mean, they're both pushing on Jon. They're two scenes to push Jon towards bending the knee to Dany, but are not with Dany. And the first
with her representatives,
yes,
which I think is important, coming to this idea of these scenes being two-handers, right? Like, as much as there's, I don't know, 6 characters in the previous scene in the dungeon, they're those who represent Jon's sides and then those that are on the Brotherhood.
Yeah.
They're 2 groups.
Yeah.
And I think in this case, that's in these 2 Dragonstone scenes, they're very much about the representatives of those characters.
So the first scene is as Jon Snow arrives at Dragonstone. He hasn't met Dany. He hasn't even seen the dragons. He's greeted on the beach by Tyrion as the hand of the queen, and they're asked to give up their weapons. They've given up their weapons, feeling that they're possibly about to be murdered, and Tyrion and Jon are walking up towards the castle together. Both these scenes happen on those steps.
And Sansa, I hear she's alive and well.
She is.
Does she miss me terribly? A sham marriage, and unconsummated.
I didn't ask.
Well, it was. Wasn't. Anyway. She's much smarter than she lets on.
She's starting to let on.
Good. At some point, I want to hear how a Night's Watch recruit became king in the north.
As long as you tell me how a Lannister became hand to Daenerys Targaryen.
Long and bloody tale. To be honest, I was drunk for most of it.
My bannermen think I'm a fool for coming in.
Of course they do. If I was your hand, I would have advised against it. General rule of thumb. Stark men don't fare well when they travel south.
True. But I'm not a Stark.
I'd say you get used to them. But you never really do. Come. The mother's waiting for you.
What is interesting about the scene is we got 2 different observations, right? Which is suddenly Tyrion, and it's imbued, I cannot help but say we got bias of the recent episodes, which is Tyrion asking about Sansa. Possibly this is the first time he's talking about Sansa in seasons, right? So him asking Jon, but he doesn't ask her about Sansa. This is what's so interesting about his opening line, which is,
And Sansa, I hear she's alive and well.
That's a rhetorical question, right? He's not like saying, is Sansa alive and well? He's saying, I know that she's alive and well. But he's steering the conversation to Sansa, which is telling the audience that he is somewhat concerned about her welfare. And he makes a joke, and he's like, she is. And in Jon Snow, typical, like, I'm not going to give you much.
She is.
It's like a tactic. Jon's like, why are we even talking about fucking Sansa? Why did you bring it up? It's a rhetorical question, right? And then he brings up the fact that they were nearly married. And so the question for me...
They weren't nearly married. They were married.
They were married, but Tyrion reminds him and the audience.
A sham marriage, and unconsummated.
But then it's like, she's much smarter than she lets on. So it's interesting because it's revealing, it's character exposition. It's about how Tyrion feels about Sansa and then how his feelings about Sansa influence Jon. What is weird about this to me is it feels exposition-y, but in a weird way, like there are pre-existing facts. We know it was a sham marriage. We know it wasn't consummated, right? Why do we need to bring it up at all? And why do we need to remind the audience of it?
I think those are excellent questions. Because also, why have this scene at all? Tyrion could be standing beside Daenerys and not have this pre-conference conversation. Going back to the thesis of the episode, right? We've got two characters who at one point knew each other well. They were both at Castle Black together. And they've now come back together with all this backstory. And this is not the first time that this happens in the episodes, in the scenes that we're looking at in this episode, but they actually refer to all their huge, long stories apart and then decide not to tell it, right?
At some point, I want to hear how a Night's Watch recruit became king in the North.
As long as you tell me how a Lannister became hand to Daenerys Targaryen.
Long and bloody tale.
So that goes to the fuck exposition thing, is like, let's not even talk about that. What is fascinating that the writers have chosen to do is, to me, Tyrion's decision to open, really, with talking about Sansa. And not only is that a decision which, as you say, is almost like a reminder of the pre-existing facts. It's reminding us that, yes, Tyrion and Sansa got married and that they knew each other and that he actually looked after her and cared for her. But I think it serves a very political process as well. Like, Tyrion is the only one between Jon and Dany who knows them,
vouch for both of them.
who knows them both, wants to vouch for both of them, wants them both to work together, but also knows how stubborn both of them are.
It's a play. It's a play from Tyrion to win. I was good to your sister, right? Well, he knows that Jon's been in Winterfell with Sansa, so who knows what Sansa said. So he's kind of preemptively defending his honor, learning that she said nothing bad about him.
Yeah.
Which is then, in season 8, paid off with the...
Maybe we should have stayed married.
You were the best of them.
What a terrifying thought.
Which is a Tyrion self-deprecating humor. It's kind of paid off from this. Like, it's a question and an answer, which is like, what has she said about me? I think Tyrion's actually genuinely curious in that moment, as much as strategy.
Yeah,
he wants to know about. Because it could have gone south if Sansa said, Tyrion was awful.
Yeah.
He's probing.
But so coming into this scene, Tyrion is the one driving the scene. He's the only one talking. Jon is backing off. He just wants to walk up to meet Dany. He's got no interest in talking to Tyrion at all. So Tyrion is driving the scene. He's the one with the objective. He's also the one who's revealing information. He's the only one who knows the true story. Well, he and Sansa are the only ones who know the true story of him and Sansa. And whether he's trying to talk about what Jon may or may not have heard or what Sansa may or may not have said, he's essentially buttering Jon up before he meets Dany and trying to reestablish rapport. And I think, this scene was very cleverly inserted in this section. And the scene ends with the dragons flying overhead. It's the first time he's seen the dragons, so he's immediately on the back foot before going in to meet with Dany in terms of a power position.
And there's some great foreshadowing with the
I'm not a Stark.
Yeah. And Tyrion is acknowledging Jon's bravery and risk-taking in coming. So he's really just working hard to reestablish rapport. So that's why, even though this scene is conveying pre-existing facts that the audience may or may not remember, it is very clear that Tyrion wants something, has an objective, and is trying to get Jon to... It's not a very clearly defined goal what he wants Jon to do. I think it's just, be open, perhaps, or be trusting.
Be trusting, I think. So what's great about this scene now, and this is the great thing about doing the podcast, is I think it does two things, right? The scene's purpose on a structural level is that Tyrion is trying to win Jon's trust.
Yeah.
In particularly, and then so Jon can then transfer that trust on to Dany. Yeah. Jon, you trust me, I trust Dany, therefore you should trust Dany. Right. But then they've chosen the information that they've chosen. It's different from the other scenes. It's all foreshadowing.
Yeah.
Right? They've turned this scene that's about that, and the stuff they've chosen to talk about, it's foreshadowing the future, which everyone wants to ship Sansa and Tyrion. Now we'll see whether that happens. But it's clear that he still has affection for her. I mean, and that doesn't have to end in marriage. You can feel affection and love for someone.
And I think he just felt sorry for her because he just watched her being tortured in King's Landing for years.
Yes, but it's an interesting combination of both. The information that they've chosen to lay is foreshadowing, and that's obviously us in hindsight. But the purpose of the scene and how they then structure the conversation serves Tyrion's purpose. And Jon, I don't think, has an objective in that scene No, his objective is like, how do you become to be Hand of Daenerys?
What I think is really great about this scene is not just what it's doing from an exposition point of view, but if you had asked any audience member about, you told them, oh, there's going to be this great scene where Jon and Tyrion meet for the first time, there's that reunion, and you'd ask them, what do you think they're going to talk about? I think the last thing anyone would have mentioned was Sansa. So the writers, I think, have done something really, really clever of reminding us of pre-existing facts and subverting audience expectations, delivering on a great scene. Anyway, I think this scene stood out to me because it felt very much that it didn't need to be there. And so it felt like a very writerly choice. And I was rewatching it with this thesis in mind. So I don't want to be critical of this scene. I think this scene kind of does exposition right, in that it never feels like exposition.
It feels like catch-up, but not exposition. Like, we know all of these facts. It's what Tyrion's choosing to recap, which is why it feels like setup. They don't feel the need to recap how he became Dany's hand. They don't feel the need to recap how Jon Snow
became King in the North.
King of the North, but they felt the need to recap that Tyrion was good to Sansa. And as you say, that's a strategy, but it's also perhaps a little bit of setup. The other bit of setup, of course, is the questions to do with the I'm not a Stark, after Tyrion's little smart-ass thing about
Stark men don't fare well when they travel south.
and the dragon responding to Jon. I mean, at this point, I had read the theories and had presumed that Jon was a Targaryen.
Well, aren't you clever?
Well, it's not that I'm clever. One, there's the idea that, a million monkeys typing conspiracy theories on the internet, one of them's going to be right. It's just the law of numbers.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, like, there was too many questions deliberately hung over Jon Snow's parentage.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, they even talked about that in early interviews with D&D about, like, George R.R. Martin asked you who you thought Jon's real parents were. And it's like, well, obviously the question of who his real parents are is a question that we're meant to be asking. I think for casual viewers, it would have just felt like very subtle foreshadowing. But when I was watching that, I'm like, see. But it just made me feel smug, which is how I mostly feel.
Welcome to my world, dear listeners.
Yes, what, you also feel smug. It's like smug and crippling disappointment. Somehow, I don't know how they're related, but somehow they're related. So we're going to finish off this little Dragonstone scene. We talked a lot about that one, and I don't know if I have as much to say, but there's Jon and Davos coming down the other way. This is how cinematic. They've walked up the stairs to meet Dany, and they're walking down the stairs to meet Dany's representative from Misfits, whatever her name is, Missandei.
Yeah.
What do you think of her?
Who?
I believe you know of whom I speak.
I think she has a good heart.
A good heart? I've noticed you staring at a good heart.
There's no time for that. I saw the Night King, Davos. I looked into his eyes. How many men do we have in the north to fight him? 10,000? Less?
Fewer.
What?
Speaking of good hearts, Missandei of North.
Sir Davos, Lord Snow.
King Snow, isn't it? No, that doesn't sound right. King John?
It doesn't matter.
Forgive me, but may I ask a question?
Of course.
Your name is Jon Snow, but your father's name was Ned Stark.
I'm a bastard. My mother and father weren't married.
Is the custom different in North?
We don't have marriage in North, so the concept of a bastard doesn't exist.
That sounds liberating.
Why did you leave your homeland?
I was stolen away by slavers.
I'm sorry.
If I may, how did a slave girl come to advise Daenerys Targaryen?
She bought me from my master and set me free.
That was good of her. Of course, you're serving her now, aren't you?
I serve my queen because I want to serve my queen. Because I believe in her.
And if you wanted to sail home to North tomorrow,
Then she would give me a ship and wish me good fortune.
you believe that?
I know it. All of us who came with her from Essos, we believe in her. She's not our queen because she's the daughter of some king we never knew. She's the queen we chose.
Will you forgive me if I switch sides?
And the question of the scene is asked right at the beginning of the scene, which is Davos asking, how do you feel about her? And there's this weird bit of like, it feels like air, which is like, who are you talking about? Oh, you know exactly who I'm talking about. It's such a weird bit of, it kind of works, but it only works because like John's a little bit taken with her.
Yeah. Can I just say that this scene, I chose it because in stark contrast to the previous one, it felt like exposition. And I think it feels like exposition because no one in this scene has an objective other than the writers.
The point is they've had the meeting. It's like, how did the meeting go? And that's what they're trying to dramatize.
Yeah.
And Davos sums it up, which is like, do you mind if I change sides now?
That's how this scene concludes. But you're right. You pointed out that, that you've got essentially, even in this scene where there's three characters, but it's still a scene about who's going to win. Is it Jon or Dany? Even though Dany's not in the scene, that's what the scene's about. And the writers want to push Jon slightly towards where he needs to get to as a character to bend the knee. So, yep, as you say, Davos and Jon are walking down the steps, talking to each other. We've played the excerpt already, but they bump into Missandei, and they essentially start with small talk. It's like, she asks,
Your name is Jon Snow, but your father's name was Ned Stark.
I'm a bastard.
Again, foreshadowing the question about his parentage.
yeah. And then they ask,
Is the custom different in North?
feels like they're at a cocktail party and they've never met before. The whole point of the scene is for Missandei to communicate to them that Dany is white savior, awesome breaker of the wheel, blah, blah, blah. And certainly by the end of the scene moves Davos's opinion of Dany.
Will you forgive me if I switch sides?
Which tips the scales for Jon.
Yeah.
It's important.
Oh, all of this is important, but I just want to contrast these two scenes.
But what makes this one feel more exposition-y?
I think, to be fair to the writers, one of the key differences is Jon and Tyrion are much bigger characters who have a pre-existing history. So Missandei is not as big a character and has never met Jon or Davos before. The other point is, coming into the scene, Tyrion has got an objective with the question. Davos, let's say Davos is, how do you feel about a queen? It never feels like in the end of this scene, Davos makes a choice. He's not trying to push Jon to make a decision within the scene.
I think it's because Davos's purpose changes. What he's saying about Dany in the beginning of the scene is, watch yourself, Jon.
A good heart? I've noticed you staring at a good heart.
And then at the second half, I think that, to me, is in hindsight what doesn't work. It's the Davos's shift. It's not that he's cynical. He's just worldly. He's world weary. That's what makes him great. That's why he's the Onion Knight. Don't be fooled by her beauty.
Yeah.
Suddenly he is fueled by the beauty.
I think that's an excellent observation. But there's also to me, there's no goal going into the scene. So you've got the same problem with Arya and Hot Pie, which is just like people seeming talking together. And that at the end of the scene, it doesn't prompt anyone. The scene very deliberately ends with the plot intruding with the arrival of the Greyjoy ship.
Is that a Greyjoy ship?
Jon or Davos or Missandei are not forced to make a decision within the scene. And I think that's why it feels so different. There was just no subtlety to the scene. There was no action in the scene. There was no objective to the characters. And I think you put these two scenes side by side, and hopefully listeners, just from hearing those two scenes next to each other, are taking lessons away from it.